controversial Professor Burton Mack does not think that the Jesus of the early church came from the Jewish tradition. His radical solution is to look elsewhere for the inspiration for the Christ we have today.
This fascination with Alexander is that you have, for the first time, a clear concept of a man-god. And so at the same time as we have this marvelous romance of Alexander filling the mentality of the time, we have the Gospels being written about Jesus, and the similarities are striking.
In a nutshell, Professor Mack is making the revolutionary claim that the fundamental nature of Christ as both man and God ultimately derived from the Greek tradition of the divinity of Alexander. Of course, the message of Jesus, as opposed to his packaging, was new.
Justin Martyr will say quite rightly, well, you guys believe that your emperors can ascend into heaven. What's wrong with us believing Jesus could ascend into heaven? We're doing the same thing. What Luke Acts did was come up with a counter-narrative. The 4th century under Constantine, when Constantine opened his arms for effect and embraced the Roman Empire, nobody ever seemed to say, well, who converted whom here? Is there a price tag for having the Roman Empire on our side? Is there kind of a deal being made that we take care of heaven and they take care of earth? If I was a bishop in the 4th century, I probably would have been on the wrong side. I probably would have gone to Nicaea and be terribly impressed like Eusebius was with the splendor of the summer palace and been invited in to have a feast with the emperor, and I might say, yeah, this is the kingdom of God on earth. Yeah, I might buy it. I do understand it. And it took an awful lot of courage maybe to even see that that might be not the best future. So, in one sense, power corrupts. Not just itself, it corrupts you as well. And that's what happened, and we have to kind of face it. The epiphany, the revelation of Caesar, his presence in the world, has brought a new creation. It says, at least in practical terms, because the whole world was going to destroy itself. They're never just talking about the Mediterranean or Italy or Rome. They're talking about the whole world has been saved by Caesar, as we saw at Axiom. So the birthday of Caesar, they say, is good news. Gospel, euangelia, the word we use for gospel. The birthday of Caesar is good news for the whole world. His epiphany has not just brought peace out of war, but creation out of chaos. So as you read this inscription, you almost see the whole theology, the whole Christian theology coming at you out of Roman imperial theology. Let me take it now out from Judaism into Romanism and the Greco-Roman world. The ascension or apotheosis of Romulus, the hero founder, if you will, of Romanism. That's taken from his statue in the Campidolia in Rome. You luckily had a good enough picture, you could blow it up. So this is the ascension or apotheosis of Romulus. You might say crudely the equivalent, the war maker of Romanism, as Moses is the lawgiver of Judaism. In Plutarch, Romulus disappeared suddenly since he had been caught up to heaven and was to be a benevolent god for the Romans instead of a good king. You recognize immediately it's sort of very similar to Philo and Moses, caught up to heaven. In the background, I've given you Romulus and Remus, as you can see. It's interesting that the Romans, they start their story with a Cain and Abel story too. The brother Romulus kills Remus. Also in Plutarch, now he's continuing the same story. Romulus has been taken up to heaven, but how do we know? Julius Proclus, and he's given all sorts of credentials. He's highly trustworthy, and he goes into the forum and he tells, traveling on the road, he had seen Romulus, fair and stately as never before, and arrayed in bright and shining armor. So it's almost like parallel to Matthew's account. He's taken up to heaven, so there's no body, there's no tomb, there's nothing like that. Then you have the witness who's seen him, and you have the mandate, very similar to what happens also in Matthew. Romulus tells Proclus, tell the Romans that if they practice self-restraint, no comment, and add valor, they will reach the utmost heights of human power.
At the end of Romulus's career, he's mustering his troops at Campus Martius. This is kind of a place that, Rome has, what is it, the city of 7 hills or whatever. This is one of them. And so he brings his troops up there, and there's a thunderclap. He floats or something up into the air, and there's a cloud that envelops him, and he's taken away in front of all of his subjects. And you go back and read that, and there are various different pieces there that are very interesting. And then almost immediately following that, there's the story of Julius Proculus, which was, maybe 4 or 5 lines later. This guy meets Romulus after he had already ascended to heaven and been thought of as a deity, meets Romulus on the road. I believe it was the Via Appia. Meets him on the road. This is the most famous road in Rome, I believe, in the Italian peninsula. Anyway, runs into this guy there. So it's a road encounter, and gives him a great commission. Go ye therefore into all the world and tell them about the greatness of Rome and this sort of thing. You've probably read it yourself. And I will forever be with you, your propitious deity, Quirinus, Romulus, or whatever. And so so I was sitting there in the garden reading this. I had never read such a thing in my life. I'd been through all these different graduate programs. Nobody had even suggested any of this. Now, I understand that Adela Yarbrough Collins includes some brief mention of Romulus in her Mark commentary. Every person in the empire, especially as you start looking at all the other histories that are obliged to include this story also in various permutations, this would have been super well known. Romulus was the founder of the empire, the modern civilization for them. This was the height of human existence, and Romulus was the founding figure of it. You couldn't get more central in terms of importance and iconic in that context. And they had temples to Romulus in every major city, and worship of Romulus and veneration and all this was a commonplace in terms of, the early emperor cult. And so anyway, I had been reading all of this, and my thought world started I just kind of fire on all cylinders. I started to think, through all of the different historical methods and literary methods and all of the different ideas of cultural, critical kind of investigation, and just everything just came together and converged in my mind. And at one moment, it was kind of like my brain just short-circuited, and I realized, holy shit, this is the same thing that we're getting in the New Testament. This feels a lot like what I read in the Gospels. Now, there's differences, obviously, but this is a lot like, I try to use analogies. I don't know what one would be good. I've tried to think, okay, what would it be like to see a story that's a lot like Santa Claus, but it's from South America or something like that, where you can pick up on, okay, yeah, whatever this, he's got a different name, and instead of reindeer, maybe he's got, I don't know, llamas or something.
Maybe you're reading Romeo and Juliet, and suddenly you're thinking back to didn't I see West Side Story in a play once? Oh my God!
Exactly.
Yeah.
This just felt like because I had been spending I've been soaking in the New Testament for a long time, reading a lot of that inside and out, translated the entire New Testament probably several times over by then. And so this was an old hat to me. I knew it inside and out at that point. And so to me, this felt like just very similar, what we would call an analog, very similar, like a next door neighbor, another version of the same sort of thing then. But that narrative by itself, though, was the kind of the last pillar in my thought of, well, even if we allow, as insane as this sounds, even if we allow that there's some of these other stories where folk beliefs or legends or whatever, the resurrection, we got to hang on to that one. That's got to be, that was kind of the last holdout for me. And this was just like the whole apple cart just fell apart right there in the garden for me. And the thing that was upsetting to me, though, is because I think my grandmother had recently passed away, or was about to. I can't remember. When my grandfather had recently passed away, my grandmother was nearly going to pass. Anyway, I had kind of held in the back of my mind that I'm going to see these people again somehow. And so all this was tied together for me psychologically in terms of how I understood what the religion was, even though I had deconstructed much of it at that point. It shouldn't have come as any surprise that this last little piece was also legendary and not to be taken as in the literalistic sense. I just kind of had a lot of assumptions there because I had been shielded in some ways from seeing a lot of these other analogs in the Greek and Roman world. And whether that's deliberate or not, we can debate. But I think there is some deliberate, because there's been a lot. I'm not the first person to bring this out. D.F. Strauss made a lot of these, discoveries 150 years ago. And you can roll back in time. Celsus made them. You can even go back to Justin Martyr, who's basically admitting it as much. And for whatever reason, and I expect my book to get pushed under as well, even though here I am bringing it out. Just the mechanics and forces of this religion tend to bury those revelations because they're inconvenient truths. They're just too upsetting for people. People don't turn to Christianity so that they could deconstruct it. Usually, they turn to it because it provides comforts in a world where we have to deal with these difficult aspects like dying and the meaning of life and this kind of thing, and creating order in our families. And so anyway, I walked back to my car and I started to cry because I realized the ramifications. It's just my mind was flooded with what this meant, because I knew I knew that I was never going to be the same again. I couldn't undo it. And in my mind, it came to my mind to think, maybe I should act like I hadn't just read that. That actually came to my mind, as honest as I was. Here I was at Yale. I traveled across the United States to learn these things, to learn everything I could. And yet this was so upsetting to me that it even entered my mind, what are my two options? I could act like I didn't just read that, or I could embrace it and deal with whatever the ramifications might be for that. But I knew I'd reached a Rubicon, a place in my, like a liminal point there where I couldn't go back. I'd either have to be a very dishonest person going forward, or I'd have to be a very brave person going forward in terms of what this meant and deconstructing my worldview at that point.
The biographer Suetonius recalled the new emperor's awkward first steps towards a new persona.
As Vespasian held court before a large audience, two men approached. They begged Vespasian to cure their afflictions. They told him a dream had predicted that sight would return if Vespasian spit in the blind man's eyes, that the other would walk if Vespasian's heel touched his lame leg. To Vespasian's amazement, the invalids were cured.
All emperors needed legitimacy, they needed authority, they needed some sign that their power came from outside, had the will of the gods behind it. And it's very common to have miracle-type stories hovering around emperors. Vespasian particularly, because he comes to power from nowhere.
Magnificent propaganda. This was what was Roman imperial theology. And yeah, I wasn't talking about emperor cult or Roman civil. This was Roman imperial theology. And in the light of Roman imperial theology, Pauline Christian theology snapped into place like that. It was like, two things suddenly coming into focus. It all made sense. Imperator, it's autocrator in Greek, Caesar, the Son of God, it's the same word used for in Mark's opening, Theou Huios, the God Augustus. So Imperator Caesar, the Son of God, the God Augustus, Sebastos, goes back to the spear of command with the rod. And then the world, the orb of the world's in his left hand with victory, Nike, on top of it.
He declares Cleopatra his wife and that they are living gods. She is Isis and he Osiris. He leaves to his children by Cleopatra all the eastern provinces. And her son by Caesar is to be given Rome in the west.
Glorious news! At Actium, in Greece, the navy of our Imperator, Octavian Caesar, under the command of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, has won a decisive victory over Queen Cleopatra and her slave, Mark Antony. The Egyptian fleet has been destroyed.
Octavian is master of the world. And at that spot of Axiom, the goddess Apollo, who is the father, the alleged father, shall we say, of Augustus, appears above his ship and says to him, Savior of the world,